Margaret Whitfield adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and checked her Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. The 52-year-old real estate mogul from Beverly Hills was not accustomed to waiting, especially not in what she considered a tourist trap. Standing outside Buckingham Palace on a sweltering July afternoon, she tapped her manicured nails against her Louis Vuitton handbag with growing irritation. The crowd around her buzzed with excitement as tourists from around the world gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Children pressed against the black iron railings, phones were held high to capture the perfect shot, and tour guides spoke in multiple languages about the rich history unfolding before them. But Margaret saw none of the magic that captivated everyone else. To her, this was simply another item to check off her European vacation list. "Excuse me," she called out to a nearby police officer, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone used to getting her way. "When exactly does this ceremony start? I have a dinner reservation at Harrods in 2 hours and I cannot be late." The officer, accustomed to dealing with impatient tourists, politely explained that the ceremony would begin shortly and that patience was required. Margaret huffed audibly, muttering something about British inefficiency under her breath. She had paid premium prices for this luxury tour, and she expected premium service. As the minutes ticked by, Margaret's frustration mounted. She began pushing through the crowd, using her elbows and sharp comments to create space for herself. "Move aside, please. I paid for priority access," she announced, though no such thing existed for the public viewing area. Other tourists exchanged glances and eye rolls, but most simply moved out of her way to avoid confrontation. Her husband Richard had stayed back at their 5-star hotel, claiming a headache, but Margaret suspected he was simply tired of her complaints about everything, from the weather to the food to the primitive payment systems. She had spent the entire week criticizing every aspect of London, from the narrow streets to the overpriced attractions, never once considering that her attitude might be the problem. When a young mother with a stroller politely asked if she could move slightly so her children could see, Margaret's response was swift and cutting. "I was here first, and I suggest you teach your children about respecting their elders." The woman's face flushed red, but she quietly moved away rather than create a scene. Margaret pulled out her phone and began taking selfies, her flash going off repeatedly despite the bright daylight. She held the phone at arm's length, trying to capture herself with the palace in the background, completely oblivious to the fact that she was blocking the view for several people behind her. When someone gently tapped her shoulder to point this out, she spun around with fire in her eyes. "Do you know who I am?" she demanded, her voice rising above the general chatter of the crowd. "I own 3 houses in California and have been featured in Architectural Digest twice. I don't need some tourist telling me how to take a photograph." The elderly gentleman who had approached her simply shook his head and walked away, muttering something about ugly Americans under his breath. Margaret heard this and felt her blood pressure rising. She was not going to let some random person disrespect her, especially not in front of all these people. As she continued to fume, the sound of marching feet began to echo from the palace grounds. The crowd stirred with anticipation, and even Margaret felt a flutter of interest despite her sour mood. The famous red-coated guards were finally making their appearance, their tall black bearskin hats bobbing in perfect synchronization as they marched in formation. The ceremony was undeniably impressive, even to someone as jaded as Margaret. The precision of the movements, the crisp sound of boots hitting pavement, and the centuries of tradition on display created an atmosphere that was both solemn and spectacular. For a brief moment, Margaret found herself genuinely engaged. Her phone lowered as she watched the guards take their positions, but as the crowd pressed closer to get better photos and videos, Margaret felt herself being pushed back from her prime viewing spot. The family with young children had somehow managed to squeeze in front of her, and a group of teenagers with their phones held high were blocking her view completely. Her momentary appreciation for the ceremony quickly evaporated, replaced by a burning sense of injustice. She began pushing back harder, her designer heels clicking against the pavement as she maneuvered through the crowd. Excuse me," she repeated, though her tone made it clear these were demands rather than polite requests. She elbowed past a couple taking photos and stepped on the foot of an elderly man using a walking cane. As Margaret fought her, Way through the crowd, her eyes locked onto something that made her pause. Just a few feet away, separated only by a low rope barrier, stood one of the famous Queen's guards. He was tall and imposing in his red tunic and bearskin hat, standing at perfect attention with his rifle held precisely at his side. The weapon gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and Margaret found herself staring at it with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. The guard's face was expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as he had been trained to do regardless of the chaos around him. He appeared almost like a statue, unmoving and silent despite the hundreds of tourists pointing cameras at him and calling out questions he would never answer. Margaret's mind began to race. Here was her opportunity to get the perfect photo, the one that would make all her friends back home jealous and prove that she had experienced something truly unique in London. All she needed was to get just a little bit closer, maybe even touch the guard or his equipment. After all, she reasoned, she had paid good money to be here, and what harm could it possibly do? Margaret studied the rope barrier separating her from the motionless guard, her mind working through what she saw as a simple problem with an obvious solution. The barrier was barely knee-high, more of a polite suggestion than a serious obstacle. Around her, other tourists were taking photos from a respectful distance, but Margaret had never been one to settle for ordinary when extraordinary was within reach. She glanced around to see if anyone was watching her specifically. The police officers were spread thin, managing the large crowd and keeping an eye on multiple areas at once. Most tourists were focused on their cameras and phones, trying to capture their own memories of the ceremony. The guard himself continued to stare straight ahead, seemingly unaware of her presence just a few feet away. Margaret had spent her entire adult life getting what she wanted through a combination of wealth, persistence, and sheer audacity. When she wanted the best table at a restaurant, she got it. When she wanted her contractor to finish work ahead of schedule, she made it happen. When she wanted to buy a house that wasn't officially for sale, she found a way. This situation, she reasoned, was no different. She took a step closer to the barrier, her heart beating faster with excitement. This would be the photo opportunity of a lifetime. She imagined showing the pictures to her social circle back in Beverly Hills, watching their faces fill with envy as she described her bold adventure. None of them would have the courage to do what she was about to do. The guard's rifle caught her attention again. It was an impressive weapon, clearly well-maintained and gleaming with military precision. Margaret had never seen such a rifle up close, and her curiosity began to override her common sense. She wondered how heavy it was, what it felt like to hold something with such historical significance. Surely, she thought, it wouldn't hurt anything to just touch it briefly. As she contemplated her next move, a small child nearby began crying, and his parents rushed to comfort him. The momentary distraction of several nearby tourists created what Margaret saw as her perfect opportunity. She checked once more to ensure no police officers were looking directly at her, then made her decision. With surprising agility for someone in high heels, Margaret stepped over the rope barrier. Her pulse quickened as she realized she had crossed into forbidden territory, but rather than retreat, she felt a rush of excitement. She was actually doing it. She was about to become part of the story rather than just an observer. The guard remained motionless, but Margaret could have sworn she saw a slight tightening around his eyes. She dismissed this as her imagination and took another step closer. Now she was within arm's reach of both the guard and his weapon. Her phone was ready in her left hand, prepared to capture what she was certain would be the most talked-about photo of her vacation. Other tourists began to notice her transgression. A few pointed in her direction, and she heard someone whisper urgently about the crazy woman who had crossed the barrier. But Margaret was beyond caring about the opinions of strangers. She had come too far to back down now. She raised her phone to take a selfie, positioning herself as close to the guard as possible without actually touching him. The angle wasn't quite right for the dramatic effect she wanted, so she moved slightly to his side. The rifle was now directly in front of her, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon light. Margaret's breathing became shallow with anticipation. She had never done anything this rebellious, this spontaneous, in her entire carefully controlled life. For someone who scheduled every minute of every day, who planned her meals a week in advance and had her assistant organize her social calendar, months ahead of time. This moment of pure impulse felt intoxicating. She snapped several photos quickly, checking each one on her phone screen to make sure the lighting and angles were perfect. But something was still missing. The photos looked impressive, but they didn't capture the full audacity of what she was doing. They could have been taken by anyone brave enough to cross the rope. Her eyes returned to the rifle. That was the key element, she realized. Anyone could stand next to a guard, but touching his weapon would prove that she had truly pushed the boundaries. It would be the ultimate proof of her boldness, the kind of story that would be retold at dinner parties for years to come. Margaret reached out slowly, her manicured fingers extending toward the rifle's stock. The weapon was positioned at the guard's side, held in a formal military stance that placed it tantalizingly close to her grasp. She could see every detail of its construction, from the worn leather sling to the brass fittings that spoke of decades of ceremonial use. The crowd around her seemed to fade away as she focused entirely on her target. Time slowed as her hand moved through the air, crossing the invisible line between appropriate tourist behavior and unthinkable violation of protocol. She was vaguely aware of voices becoming more urgent, of people starting to move in her direction, but these distractions seemed distant and unimportant. Her fingertips made contact with the cold metal of the rifle barrel, sending a thrill of triumph through her entire body. She had done it. She was actually touching a Queen's Guard's weapon, something that probably hadn't happened in decades, if ever. She quickly positioned her phone for the perfect shot, determined to capture this moment of unprecedented access. But as Margaret wrapped her fingers more firmly around the rifle, preparing to pose for her ultimate selfie, she failed to notice the subtle change in the guard's posture. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and his response would be swift, decisive, and utterly shocking to a privileged tourist who had never faced real consequences for her actions. The moment of Margaret's greatest triumph was about to become the beginning of her worst nightmare, and the dozens of phone cameras pointed in her direction would ensure that every humiliating second would be captured for the world to see. The transformation in the Queen's Guard was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment he was a silent, statue-like figure, and the next he exploded into action with the precision of a trained military professional. His voice boomed across the courtyard with such authority that it seemed to freeze every person within 100 yards. "Step back from the Queen's Guard." The command rang out like a thunderclap, delivered with the full power of his trained military voice. The words echoed off the palace walls, causing birds to scatter from nearby trees and children to burst into tears at the sudden, shocking volume. Margaret's hand flew back from the rifle as if she had been electrocuted. Her phone tumbled from her grasp, clattering onto the pavement with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. Her face, which had been flushed with excitement just seconds before, now drained of all color as the reality of her situation began to dawn on her. The guard's movement was like watching a perfect military machine spring into action. Without breaking his commanding gaze or lowering the volume of his voice, he shifted his rifle to a defensive position and took one precise step toward Margaret. His bearskin hat, which had seemed almost comical from a distance, now appeared imposing and intimidating as it added to his already considerable height. "You have violated a security perimeter," he continued, his voice carrying such authority that several tourists instinctively took steps backward, even though they had done nothing wrong. "Remain where you are and do not move." Margaret found herself frozen in place, not by choice but by the sheer shock of the situation. In her 52 years of life, no one had ever spoken to her with such commanding authority. Her wealth and social status had always provided her with a buffer against direct confrontation, and she had never experienced anything remotely like this public humiliation. Around her, the crowd had transformed from casual tourists into an audience witnessing a dramatic confrontation. Phone cameras that had been pointed at the ceremony were now focused exclusively on Margaret and the guard. The clicking of camera shutters filled the air like electronic applause, and she could hear the distinctive chimes of various social media apps as people began uploading videos in real time. Other Queen's Guards in the area had also sprung into action. Their coordinated response demonstrated years of training for exactly this type of security breach. 2 additional guards moved into flanking positions, their own voices joining the chorus of commands echoing across the courtyard. The ceremony itself seemed to pause as the guards prioritized the security situation over their traditional routine. Unauthorized contact with ceremonial weapons is strictly forbidden, the original guard continued, his voice showing no signs of diminishing, in volume or intensity. You will comply with all instructions from security personnel. Margaret tried to speak, to explain that she was just a tourist, that she meant no harm, but her voice came out as little more than a squeak. The words died in her throat as she realized that hundreds of people were staring at her, recording her humiliation for posterity. She could already imagine these videos spreading across the internet, her face becoming synonymous with entitled tourist behavior. Police officers were now pushing through the crowd, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Margaret could hear fragments of their conversation, official-sounding codes and references that suggested this situation was being treated with the utmost seriousness. What had seemed like a harmless photo opportunity was rapidly escalating into what appeared to be a major security incident. The lead police officer, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, approached Margaret with the confident stride of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Ma'am, I need you to place your hands where I can see them and follow my instructions exactly," she said, her voice professional but firm. Margaret's legs felt weak beneath her. She had expected perhaps a gentle scolding, maybe being asked to step back behind the barrier. She had never imagined that touching the rifle would result in this level of response. The seriousness in everyone's faces told her that this was not going to end with a simple apology and a warning. "I'm so sorry," she finally managed to whisper, her voice shaking with a combination of fear and embarrassment. "I didn't know. I'm just a tourist. I was just trying to take a photo." The police officer's expression did not soften. "Ma'am, ignorance of security protocols is not an excuse. These guards are protecting one of the most important buildings in the United Kingdom, and any unauthorized contact with their equipment is treated as a potential security threat." As Margaret stood there surrounded by stern-faced officials and gawking tourists, she began to understand the magnitude of her mistake. This wasn't just about breaking a simple rule or crossing a rope barrier. She had touched the weapon of a guard whose job was to protect the royal family. In a world where security threats were taken with deadly seriousness, her actions could be interpreted in ways she had never considered. The crowd continued to grow as word spread through the area that something dramatic was happening. Tour guides were pointing in her direction and explaining to their groups what they were witnessing. Street performers had stopped their acts to watch the real-life drama unfolding. Even other police officers and palace staff were gathering to observe the situation. Margaret's designer sunglasses had fallen to the ground during the commotion, and without them, she felt even more exposed and vulnerable. Her carefully styled hair was beginning to wilt in the heat and stress, and she could feel perspiration forming on her forehead. Despite the cool London weather, every aspect of her polished appearance was beginning to unravel along with her confidence. The guard who had initially challenged her remained in his alert position, his eyes never leaving her face. His training required him to maintain this level of readiness until the situation was fully resolved and she was removed from the area. Margaret found his unwavering stare more intimidating than any words could have been. As more officials arrived on the scene, Margaret realized that her simple photo opportunity had triggered a response involving multiple levels of security personnel. This was not going to end quickly, and it was not going to end quietly. The senior police officer produced a pair of handcuffs from her belt, the metallic click as she opened them, seeming to echo through the suddenly quiet crowd. Margaret stared at the restraints in complete disbelief, her mind struggling to process that this was actually happening to her. The woman who had never received so much as a parking ticket was about to be arrested in front of hundreds of witnesses. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for breach of security protocols and interfering with official duties," the officer announced in a clear, carrying voice that ensured everyone nearby could hear every word. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you do say may be taken down and used as evidence against you." Margaret's knees nearly buckled. "Arrested? But I'm American. I'm a tourist." This is just a misunderstanding." Her voice rose to a near shriek, causing several children in the crowd to move closer to their parents. The desperation in her tone only seemed to make the situation more dramatic for the growing audience of spectators. The handcuffs clicked into place around her wrists with a finality that made the situation undeniably real. Margaret had watched enough police shows to know what handcuffs looked like, but feeling the cold metal against her skin was an entirely different experience. The weight of them seemed to drag down her arms, and she could already feel them chafing against her expensive diamond bracelet. "This is ridiculous," she continued, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "Do you know who I am? I own property worth millions of dollars. I pay more in taxes than you probably make in a year." Her attempts to assert her status only served to make her appear more entitled and out of touch to the watching crowd. A teenager with his phone held high called out, "Lady, this is going viral." His comment was met with nervous laughter from several bystanders, and Margaret could see the glow of dozens of phone screens pointed in her direction. She realized with growing horror that her humiliation was being broadcast to the world in real time. The police officer remained professional despite Margaret's increasingly frantic protests. "Ma'am, your nationality and personal wealth have no bearing on British security laws. Everyone is subject to the same rules when visiting royal properties." Her calm response only highlighted how out of control Margaret had become. As they began to escort her away from the guard post, Margaret's expensive high heels made walking difficult. She stumbled slightly, her designer handbag swinging awkwardly as her hands were restrained behind her back. The contrast between her obviously expensive clothing and her current predicament was not lost on the crowd, many of whom began murmuring about rich Americans who thought money could buy them anything. "Please," Margaret pleaded as they walked, "can't we just forget about this? I'll make a donation to charity or pay a fine or whatever you want. This doesn't need to go any further." Her voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by naked desperation as she began to understand the serious consequences she was facing. A police van had arrived at the edge of the crowd, its blue lights flashing and adding to the circus atmosphere of the scene. The sight of the vehicle waiting for her made Margaret's situation feel even more surreal. She had never imagined that her European vacation would include a ride in the back of a police vehicle. The crowd parted as they approached the van, creating a pathway lined with curious faces and recording devices. Margaret felt like she was walking a gauntlet of judgment, each step taking her further from her comfortable life and deeper into a nightmare of public humiliation. She could hear people commenting on her appearance, her behavior, and speculating about what would happen to her next. "Look at her designer outfit," someone commented. "Probably spent more on those shoes than most people make in a month." Another voice added, "Typical rich tourist thinking the rules don't apply to her." The comment stung because Margaret knew they were accurate assessments of her attitude and behavior. As they reached the police van, Margaret made one last desperate appeal. "Officer, please, I have a dinner reservation. My husband is expecting me back at the hotel. Can't we resolve this with a warning? I promise I'll never do anything like this again." Her priorities seemed absurdly misplaced given the circumstances, and her mention of dinner reservations only reinforced the crowd's perception of her as hopelessly out of touch. The officer opened the van door and began the process of helping Margaret inside, a procedure made awkward by her handcuffs and her continued protests. "Ma'am, the time for warnings was before you decided to cross security barriers and touch military equipment. Your actions have consequences, regardless of your personal schedule." Margaret's phone, which had fallen during the initial confrontation, was retrieved by another officer and placed in an evidence bag. Watching her device disappear into official custody felt like losing her last connection to her normal life. Without her phone, she couldn't call her lawyer, couldn't contact her husband, couldn't even check her social media to see how badly this was playing out online. As she was finally seated in the back of the van, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the window. Her carefully maintained appearance was in ruins. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared with perspiration and tears she didn't remember shedding, and her expensive clothes wrinkled from the arrest process. She looked exactly like what she had become, a criminal being taken into custody. The van doors closed with a solid thunk that seemed to seal her fate. Through the small windows, she could still see the crowd of tourists, many of whom continued to point phones in her direction, even as the vehicle prepared to drive away. She realized that by the time she reached the police station, videos of her arrest would probably already be spreading across every social media platform imaginable. Margaret slumped back in the hard plastic seat, the handcuffs making it impossible to find a comfortable position. The van began to move, taking her away from Buckingham Palace and toward a police station where she would face the full consequences of her impulsive decision. As London passed by through the small windows, she began to understand that her life would never be quite the same again. The Belgravia police station was a far cry from the luxury hotels Margaret was accustomed to visiting during her travels. The building's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over everything, making even the newest fixtures appear worn and institutional. As she was led through the main entrance, still in handcuffs, Margaret felt the stares of everyone in the waiting area. Even here, away from the tourist crowds, her arrest was attracting attention. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a patient demeanor, looked up from his paperwork as they approached. "What do we have here?" he asked, his tone suggesting this was just another routine booking in what was probably a long shift, filled with various tourist-related incidents. "Security breach at Buckingham Palace," the arresting officer replied briskly. "Crossed barriers, made unauthorized contact with a Queen's Guards rifle, refused initial commands to comply." She handed over a folder of paperwork that had apparently been prepared during the short journey from the palace. The sergeant's eyebrows rose slightly as he reviewed the charges. "Unauthorized contact with military equipment, that's a serious matter," he said, looking at Margaret with renewed interest. "Especially given the current security climate. We'll need to process this one thoroughly." Margaret felt a new wave of panic wash over her as the reality of her situation continued to unfold. "Please, officer, this is all just a terrible misunderstanding. I'm a respectable businesswoman from California. I've never been in trouble with the law in my life. Surely we can work something out." The desk sergeant's expression remained neutral and professional. "Ma'am, everyone who comes through here tells us it's their first time and that they're respectable citizens. What matters is what happened today, not your previous record." He began typing information into his computer, the clicking of keys, emphasizing the mechanical nature of the process she was now caught up in. The booking process was methodical and humiliating. Margaret was photographed from multiple angles, the flash making her squint and highlighting every sign of stress and dishevelment in her appearance. Her fingerprints were taken using an electronic scanner, the device beeping each time it successfully captured another print. With each step, she felt her identity as a powerful, wealthy woman being stripped away and replaced with the impersonal designation of a criminal suspect. "I need to call my lawyer," Margaret insisted as they removed her jewelry and placed it in a plastic bag. "And my husband. He'll be worried sick when I don't return to the hotel." Her voice had taken on a pleading quality that would have been unthinkable to her just hours earlier. "You'll be allowed one phone call after processing is complete," the sergeant replied. "But I should mention that it's currently after business hours in California, so your lawyer might not be immediately available." This practical consideration hadn't occurred to Margaret, and she realized that even her wealth and connections couldn't overcome the simple obstacle of time zones. A female constable led Margaret to a small holding cell, explaining that she would need to wait there while they completed their investigation and determined what charges would be formally filed. The cell was clean but spartanly furnished with just a metal bench and a small sink. Margaret had never been in such a confined space, and the click of the lock engaging behind her seemed to echo with finality. Alone for the first time since her arrest, Margaret finally had a moment to fully process what had happened. She sat on the hard metal bench, still wearing her expensive clothes that now felt completely inappropriate for her surroundings. The reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow, and she began to shake as the adrenaline of the past few hours wore off. Through the small window in her cell door, she could see police officers going about their routine duties. To them, she was just another case to be processed, another person who had made poor decisions and now had to face the consequences. Her wealth, her social status, her successful business career, none of it mattered within these walls. When she was finally allowed to make her phone call, Margaret's hands trembled as she dialed her husband's number. The phone rang several times before Richard's sleepy voice answered. "Margaret? Where are you? It's past midnight here, and you were supposed to be back hours ago." "Richard, I'm in jail," she said, the words feeling surreal as she spoke them. "I'm actually in a British jail and I need you to help me. I need you to call our lawyer, and maybe the embassy, and figure out how to get me out of here." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Margaret wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was filled with confusion and disbelief. "You're what? Margaret, what on earth did you do?" As she tried to explain the situation, Margaret realized how ridiculous her actions sounded when described to someone else. The idea of crossing barriers and touching a guard's rifle seemed not just foolish but inexplicably reckless. She found herself unable to adequately explain what had possessed her to act so impulsively. "They're treating this like some kind of terrorist incident," she told Richard, her voice rising with renewed panic. "There are serious charges, and they keep talking about security protocols and military equipment. This isn't just a simple tourist mistake anymore." Richard's response was not the immediate promise of help and support she had expected. "Margaret, I warned you about your behavior on this trip. I told you that your attitude was going to get you into trouble eventually, but I never imagined anything like this." His disappointment was clear even across the international phone connection. After the call ended, Margaret was returned to her cell to wait. The holding area was quiet except for the occasional sound of other detainees being processed or released. She had no idea how long she might be held, what the charges against her might ultimately be, or when she might see her husband again. As the hours passed, Margaret began to understand that her privileged life had not prepared her for a situation where money and connections couldn't immediately solve her problems. She was at the mercy of a foreign legal system, facing charges she didn't fully understand, and completely dependent on the professionalism and fairness of people she had initially tried to intimidate with her wealth and status. The woman who had started the day complaining about dinner reservations was now wondering if she would be spending the night in a jail cell, and possibly many more nights to come. Margaret was released on bail the following afternoon, but stepping out of the police station into the London daylight felt nothing like the freedom she had expected. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled from spending the night in a cell. Her hair was disheveled, and her face showed the strain of 24 hours that had completely upended her understanding of her place in the world. Richard was waiting for her outside the station, his expression a mixture of relief and profound embarrassment. "The hotel lobby was full of reporters this morning," he said quietly as they got into a taxi. "Apparently the videos of your arrest have gone viral. Our names are all over the international news." Margaret's stomach dropped as she realized the scope of her humiliation. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Bad," Richard replied, showing her his phone screen. The video of her touching the guard's rifle and the subsequent arrest had been viewed millions of times across multiple platforms. News outlets around the world had picked up the story, with headlines like "Entitled American Tourist Attacks Royal Guard" and "Beverly Hills Woman's Palace Meltdown Goes Viral." The comments under the videos were brutal. People from around the world had weighed in on her behavior, and the consensus was overwhelmingly negative. Margaret found herself being called everything from a typical ugly American to much worse, terms that she couldn't bear to read. Her face was now recognized by millions of people as the symbol of entitled tourist behavior. Back in California, the story had taken on a life of its own. Local news stations were reporting on their hometown embarrassment, and real estate industry publications were covering the incident because of Margaret's professional prominence. Her business partners had called emergency meetings to discuss damage control, and several potential deals had already fallen through as clients distanced themselves from the controversy. The legal proceedings in London stretched out over several weeks, requiring multiple court appearances that kept the story in the international spotlight. Margaret's lawyer, who had flown in from Los Angeles, explained that while the charges were serious, her cooperation and apparent genuine remorse might help minimize the consequences. During one court hearing, the prosecutor read aloud some of The social media comments Margaret had made about London and British people during her vacation. Comments that had been discovered by internet detectives digging into her online presence. Her complaints about primitive payment systems and inefficient British service now seemed particularly tone-deaf given her current circumstances. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, was clearly unimpressed by Margaret's expressions of remorse. "Mrs. Whitfield, your actions represented not just a security breach but a fundamental disrespect for British institutions and traditions. The fact that you appear to have documented your contempt for this country on social media makes your apologies ring somewhat hollow." Margaret was ultimately sentenced to a substantial fine, community service, and a 5-year ban from visiting any royal properties. The sentence was lenient compared to what she might have faced for a genuine security breach, but the public nature of the proceedings ensured that her humiliation was complete and lasting. The flight home to Los Angeles was a nightmare of recognition and whispered comments from other passengers. Margaret had tried to disguise herself with sunglasses and a hat, but her face was too well known from the viral videos. Flight attendants were professional but cool, and she overheard one passenger explaining to their child why they shouldn't act like that lady from the internet. Back in Beverly Hills, Margaret discovered that her social circle had largely abandoned her. Friends who had once competed to host her at dinner parties now declined to return her calls. The exclusive country club where she had been a member for over a decade quietly suggested that she might want to consider resigning her membership to avoid making other members uncomfortable. Her real estate business, which had taken decades to build, crumbled within months. Clients who had once sought her out specifically because of her reputation for getting what she wanted now saw her as a liability. The woman who had been featured in Architectural Digest was now better known as the Palace Karen, who had humiliated herself and her country on the world stage. Margaret tried to salvage her reputation through a series of public apologies and charity work, but the internet has a long memory. Every attempt at rehabilitation was met with reminders of her viral moment. Memes featuring her face became popular, and she found herself being referenced in comedy shows and late-night television monologues. The marriage to Richard, already strained by years of Margaret's demanding behavior, didn't survive the scandal. He filed for divorce 6 months after their return, citing irreconcilable differences and the impossible social situation her actions had created. In the settlement, Margaret lost half of her remaining assets and found herself truly alone for the first time in her adult life. A year later, Margaret sat in a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, a far cry from her former mansion. She had been forced to take a job with a small real estate agency, working under a boss 20 years younger than herself, who treated her with the kind of casual dismissal she had once directed at service workers. The woman who had once complained about waiting 5 minutes for a ceremony now understood patience in ways she never had before. She had learned what it felt like to be powerless, to be judged by strangers, and to face consequences that couldn't be negotiated away with money or connections. Margaret still thought about that moment at Buckingham Palace every day. In her memory, she could still feel the cold metal of the rifle under her fingertips and hear the guard's thunderous voice commanding her to step back. But now, instead of remembering the thrill of rebellion, she felt only shame and regret. Quentin. Videos of her arrest continued to circulate online, ensuring that her moment of entitled foolishness would never be forgotten. She had become a permanent part of internet history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of privilege and the swift justice of public humiliation. The woman who had once demanded to know if people knew who she was had gotten her wish in the most devastating way possible. Now everyone knew exactly who Margaret Whitfield was, and they would never let her forget it. Her story served as a reminder that in the age of social media and viral videos, a single moment of poor judgment can destroy a lifetime of carefully constructed success, and that some mistakes can never truly be undone.